Heads up, it's the Mario Brothers Nintendo didn't want you to know about. Because it wasn't on Nintendo and they'd just rather you buy their version instead. That's better and stuff. I mean, sure, fair enough. If you don't know, you should know. This is Mario Brothers, released in 1988 for the Atari 8-bit computer line. This version being the Atari XE version released, which is different from what 5200 owners got back in the day, which didn't happen often because both platforms are basically the same hardware under the hood and they usually got the same games, with rare exceptions. And I would like to remind people that, yes, once upon a time, Mario graced other consoles not made by Nintendo. Shocking as it may seem, but here you are, there it is. And lots of us older folks who never went to an arcade first experienced these vintage Nintendo arcade titles via home ports on the various Atari and ColecoVision platforms. Intellivision owners were out of luck unless you want to count that gimped version of Donkey Kong they were stuck with, but that's another story for another time. But this is classic Mario Brothers. Long before he was super, ventured to other worlds, and went out on galaxy-spanning odysseys of wonder, or whatever the case may be. He and brother Luigi were humble plumbers charged with clearing the infested sewer system of constantly emerging vermin comprising turtles, crabs, and fighter flies. You do this by bumping the floor underneath to flip the critter over and then run up to kick him off the board. Once all the critters were cleared from a scene, you move on to the next one, which gets progressively harder, obviously. Every so often, you'll play a bonus stage where you have 20 seconds to collect all the coins on screen, the rewards being some bonus points and possibly an extra life if you had a high enough score, of course. Now, Mario Bros. 8-bit visually leans more old school in that it more or less attempts to replicate the arcade original setup, wherein the 7800 port, which came out around the same time, copied the NES homework. As such, there are bits featured here that are missing from the 7800 version, such as the intermissions introducing new critters to the mix. You've also got the old school costume colors rather than the newer colors of the NES release, and there's even more animations like the shell creepers getting out of their shells during recovery and such. Now, it's not the prettiest looking thing, the color choices are quite garish here, but in terms of replicating the overall look, this isn't too bad. If nothing else, is a step above the 5200 version, which came out much earlier, and probably a smart move to make a whole new version instead of just recycling that version, as is usually the case with these formats, because again, Atari 8-bit computer line and the 5200 shared the same hardware underneath. With regards to gameplay, however, and in a bit of an inverse from the Food Fight game we looked at a couple days ago, the edge goes to 7800 with slightly faster gameplay. 8-bit Mario Bros. Plays a tad slower in comparison and in some respects feels a bit more sluggish in general. It's not to say the game plays poorly, on the contrary, control seems fine for the most part and generally responsive, plays well enough, somewhat consistent with how Mario Bros. Usually plays, whether it be solo or with a second player, and the game also lets you choose your starting level, which is how some of these games determined difficulty back in the day. But when I compare this to the 7800 port, that version seems to run a bit faster than this one does. And I don't think I'm being unfair in that comparison because both these versions came out around the same time. Again, this is not a rehash of the old 5200 version. This one tries to be more in line with the arcade game, which, again, gives it that uniqueness of sorts compared to the other version, which felt like copying Nintendo's homework. Which isn't a bad thing in all fairness because that version still turned out pretty good. And the 8-bit version, despite the slower speed, still plays like vintage Mario Brothers. You should feel right at home if you've played enough incarnations of this thing long enough. Slight adjustment in controls and momentum, sure, but any home port that isn't a direct arcade or Famicom emulation is going to have that anyway. Just about the only thing that both versions falter on for different reasons is sound output. The 7800 version's antiquated 2600 sound processing results in scratchier sound quality, while the 8-bit version is much cleaner sounding but still falls below par. It has the jingles, it tries to recreate the sounds to the best of its technological ability, but it's just not as good sounding. The one failing, but not one that kills the game entirely. Overall, Mario Bros. For Atari 8-bit XEGS-TUV, whatever was in line at the time. Not a bad version of Mario Bros. All things considered, even if it's not quite as good as Nintendo's own NES port, or even the Atari 7800 conversion, both of which were available around that same time. The slower speed is something players will have to adjust to, but once you do, you'll find a perfectly serviceable conversion that's still fairly playable and actually quite enjoyable. All in all, this one's just fine.